Welcome to Sounds Like Portraits. I'm Philippe Ungar. This is a podcast with creative humans. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes or Spotify, and thanks for giving your comments on soundslikeportraits.com. In this episode, I'm talking about bilingualism with Fabrice Jaumont, education attaché for the Embassy of France to the United States. Do you know that you could lose your mother tongue in only 2 years by not practicing it? Although the roots of bilingual education in the United States can be traced back to the 17th century, there is a new push to produce bilingual citizens and create a cultural sense of community. As Fabrice says, a bilingual revolution for the common good is already underway. But bilingualism is also a strong advantage in terms of creativity. Fabrice told me that for his own writing process, a lot of ideas come from a constant back and forth between French and English. He can always go back to another language and see how it produces other ideas. It's time to listen to him. And to start, he told me what he tried to do all his life.
All my life, I've always tried to make the world a better place, starting with children in schools and education. That's what I've been doing for the last 30 years.
How did you get involved in education?
Well, you start by liking school because you have good teachers and teachers who show you a way of getting better and growing up and doing interesting things. And for me, it started in the 6th grade with a great teacher, Monsieur Bertrand, who was an English teacher. And he took me to England with him and a class. And then we spent, 2 weeks or something like that in the south of England. And for me, that trip and that teacher have had a tremendous influence. And they still have a tremendous influence because it's shaped my entire career and the rest of my life.
Can you be more specific about this influence? What did you learn at the time in England, in the south of England?
Well, I was meeting English people. I stayed in family, kids my age, and these were like a working class family in the south of England. It was my first experience in a different country, in a different culture, a different language, in a family. And I spent the evenings with them, weekends we were going to different places, and I was sharing meals with them, and all these experiences were really, for me, an incredible moment. I think it was the first time I realized that I could be somebody else, I could be sharing somebody else's perspective, and I could be appreciating my own culture by doing that. Because once you're stepping outside of your shoes and learning about another language or another country, another family in that case, then you look back at your own, and then you start comparing, you start analyzing and appreciating even more what you've got as a heritage, as a linguistic heritage and a cultural heritage.
So traveling, and especially traveling in England, gave you a kind of distance?
Exactly. That's exactly the right word, distance. And that distance for me was liberating. And I think it was also very contagious because I wanted to go back every year. And then at some point I did not come back. And I got a teaching assistantship position in Dublin this time, at Trinity College, and spent a couple of years there, and then moved on to the US, and I'm still here in the US.
So how did you get interested in bilingualism, not only for you, but for other people?
I realized the opportunities that it gave me, and then the world it opened for me, and then I thought that's worth sharing, that's worth developing on a large scale for many people. I came from a very monolingual background.
What do you mean?
Well, coming from, northern France with families who spoke French and schools that spoke French. And I enjoyed leaving that monolingualism. I enjoyed, showing everyone that I could be fluent in another language. And then I think these were an early realization that being bilingual is a good thing, and that it should be offered to every child as early and as young as possible.
Technically, what does it mean to be bilingual? How do you define it?
There is a very basic definition that was given to me by a world-renowned linguist called François Grosjean, who says that being bilingual is to speak at least two languages on an equal and regular basis. And sometimes you can even lose one, your language or your mother tongue. That happens too.
It happens.
It happens. You can lose your mother tongue. You can forget it. This has happened to many people, not just to young children. You can do it even as an adult by not practicing it after a while. I've met many friends who spent a couple of years, and just a couple of years, in speaking English only and being immersed in English, and they had a terrible times speaking French to me, although they were francophones. And they were realizing that they had lost their mother tongue, which was, in 2 years, it was shocking that it can go very fast. But it happens with children, it happens all the time. That's part of the reason why I got engaged in this field. I don't want us to lose our languages. I want us and families and communities to sustain our linguistic heritage, and that's something that has now become central to what I do. I want every child to know his or her parents' language, and being able to communicate with their grandparents, for instance, in a meaningful way. In the US, it is quite shocking to see how quickly children are no longer exposed to their parents' language and their grandparents, so they lose that bond, they lose that connection with their family.
What's the reason?
Well, there are many reasons depending on how the status of your language in your community. Many parents will choose not to speak their native language to their children for a bunch of reasons. Sometimes because they want to protect them against discriminations and prejudices. Sometimes they just are they don't think it's worth it to share their language with their children. So you see these and you hear those stories very often, and that creates this distance between the child and his parents. That has an impact on their identity and how later on they will reconnect or not to that language or that culture. And some of them are quite sad, actually, that they were not given that connection, that link. That bond.
Is it irreversible?
It is not. Many try to revitalize it later on in life. For some, it's a harder process, having to relearn, your language. But it's still possible. It's never too late. That's what I tell parents, particularly parents who are not able to put their kids in a bilingual program. It's never too late. You can always do it later on. There are many ways of doing it. It doesn't have to be at school. You can do it on weekends. You can do it during the summer. It's never too late to learn languages.
I have a very personal question about that. Do you feel different when you speak English?
Yeah, you can say that. There's less. I don't know. The emotions, I would say, are different from one language to the other. And when you start using your mother tongue, sometimes you get into a different emotional sphere. Although after a few years, I can start to relate even more in English. I think that's how you would feel different. And I've seen this also in different settings where people would start crying the minute they spoke in their mother tongue, and then they switched to English for, let's say, an official speech or something like that. And then it was back to business. They were not crying, not showing any emotions.
It's connected to another sphere of emotions.
It is definitely connected to different buttons that get you emotional or not. That's one way of seeing it. That's how I've experienced it.
What about the voice? Do you experience a different voice in English and in French?
Yeah, it's a good question. The sound of a language varies from language to language, and then your voice changes with that. With English, definitely, and sometimes when I try to speak Spanish, it will do it as well. And it is interesting to see how your voice will adapt or fluctuate depending on the language that you're speaking. I may sound more monochord when I speak French, or everything's being pronounced in the same tone, when in English I would have more rhythm in my voice. But yeah, this varies from people to people.
What did you learn about you from that? Because it gives a certain distance. We're talking about the distance from a culture to another. What did you learn from the distance you get inside yourself?
I think it's an opportunity to have different worlds within ourselves, and being able to switch back and forth between those worlds, between those spaces. For me, I love writing in English, for instance. I write in French too, but then being able to have those two writing spheres, writing spaces, it generates more ideas, more creativity, and then you can translate them, transfer them somehow to the other language. And I think it's a real advantage. You can't be stuck with ideas because you can always go back to that other language and see how it will produce other ideas. I use it as a very creative sphere for my writings and for my talks, and a lot of ideas come from that constant back and forth between those two languages.
Can we take an example of that?
A lot of the writing that I did for my books were in English, and I translated this work. And going back to the French the formulations would open new ideas and make me rethink what I was saying in English. This is something useful to be able to translate and then revisit the original text within myself, basically. And then from then on, build clarity and depth into what I was trying to convey as a message.
You became a real translator within your intellectual process.
Constantly, I always use that. At least, if you juxtapose these languages and compare the way we say things, being able to compare, being able to revisit and revise, and this is something that you can't do when you're monolingual. This is what being bilingual does to you, having those two possibilities within yourself and banging those possibilities against each other and creating even a third possibility out of this constant back and forth. That is what bilingual process is for me.
What are the most challenging issues to create a sustainable dual language education in America?
The U.S. has been at the forefront of bilingual education since the 1960s, although there were bilingual schools, way back when in the 17th century, when the early settlers were coming to the U.S., there were bilingual schools already back then. But since the 1960s and the civil rights movement and the protests and everything, that's how this country started to create more bilingual schools. There were private schools before.
For immigrant people.
For immigrant people or for expatriate families and so forth. But it became very popular in the 1960s and early 70s, particularly coming from Canada. The model of language immersion was very successful in Canada, and then it crossed the border. Programs were being created in public schools throughout the U.S. At first it was to teach English to newly arrived immigrants and get them equal opportunities and access to this society. But then, as this developed, more and more families saw the advantages of this pedagogical model. And now, 40 years later, the dual language model is booming in the U.S. with thousands of schools embracing it and in many languages. That is a unique advantage for a society like this one. And the US is fairly monolingual. And like my friend Greg Roberts says, monolingualism is the illiteracy of the 21st century. I believe it is right. He's right saying this, and I think it can be changed in this country, despite the fact that this country is fairly monolingual. There are signs that many more communities and even an entire middle class is embracing the value of being multilingual. So there are challenges in trying to develop this and scale it and make it sustainable. You need a number of good people who are willing to work very hard for this. You need also to find the teachers who will teach in 2 languages and be certified. You need the support of communities, of donors, of public funds as well.
The parents.
And the parents. For me, the parents are the engine of change in this world of bilingual education. That's what I talk about in my book, The Bilingual Revolution. I think parents have the ability to change the landscape of their schools and create those programs, dual language programs, in their schools. If you give them the recipe, the roadmap to creating a program, then they're very efficient, and once they're organized, they can very well change a school, a city, and an entire country.
In an entire country. Can you develop a little more?
Well, if more schools join this revolution, if more funds are allocated, if more people now start thinking in terms of embracing diversity, and whether it's linguistic diversity or cultural diversity, but being open and welcoming to other people's languages and culture, I think this means this is a society that builds bridges and not walls. So ultimately, it generates more peace. So that's how I see the potential of bilingual education. It is definitely a way to create more peace in our schools, in our towns, and overall in our countries.
Is it always easy as a bilingual person to be accepted as a member of 2 or 3 different cultures by the other people, by monolingual people?
It used to be that families would hide the fact that they spoke Spanish or Chinese or even native languages, Native American languages. It's the same story. It's different if your language has some cachet and some prestige. You don't have to hide the fact, although if I think about French in Louisiana or Maine in the 1940s or 50s, a lot of families had to go underground and hide the fact that they spoke French because of fear of being discriminated against. Even at the time with the Ku Klux Klan, there were stories of French speakers in Maine or in Louisiana who were being threatened by the Ku Klux Klan for speaking French, and that happened to other linguistic groups, obviously. Here you hear stories of Spanish speakers being insulted or threatened, if they're speaking Spanish in the supermarket. So these are the kinds of things that should be fought against. And this is what I try to do as well with my work, and try to make people reflect on that and embrace this linguistic diversity, because it's a richness. It's something that we all need, and it's beneficial to our country and to our economy and to our society in general.
So it's like the multilingual education is like the happy globalization. I mean, the globalization with understanding and respect for diversity.
Yeah, as opposed to globalization with anglicizations or the dominance of English around the world. Yes, definitely. That's the counter alternative to globalization. It's one that embraces diversity and that generates tolerance for everybody's differences. So yes, and I'm all for that. It should be the new norm. Together we can make this change.
That's the last step of the interview. I call it the moment of solitude. Please hold the microphone and add whatever you want to the interview.
Moment of solitude. That's a good one. Through my activism and my books, I decided to embark in a new initiative called the Center for the Advancement of Languages, Education and Communities. And this is a nonprofit organization in New York with the mission of advocating for dual language education, but also empowering families and linguistic communities so that they can get those programs created and get the resources and the support, and for their children so that they create that bond between their linguistic heritage, their cultural heritage. And that's what I want for my own children, and that's what I want for every parent. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy this podcast.
Thank you, Fabrice, for sharing your story. It was Sounds Like Portraits, a podcast by Philippe Ungar. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes and Spotify, and thanks for giving your comments on soundslikeportraits.com. Music Charmeuse de Serpent, composed and conducted by Olivier Glisson. See you soon for the next episode.